Welcome everybody to our first Hamilton Science Faith Forum event of 2022. So we're a chapter of the CSCA, and you will see the CSCA website flashing in front of you. So Herman Proper, who's been part of our planning committee for the last few years, kindly offered to organize today's session, and I will hand it over to him.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. I'm very pleased to welcome you and to introduce Dr. Berkelaar to you. He's a professor at Redeemer University in Ancaster, which is part of Hamilton. Hamilton calls itself the city of waterfalls. Being on the Niagara Escarpment, we have more than 100 waterfalls within the city. And so the health of our waters, of course, is of great concern. And Redeemer University itself is a Reformed Christian university founded on the principle that there's not a square inch of creation of which Jesus doesn't say, "This is mine." And so Redeemer tries to help students develop that consciousness and that approach to their life as Christians in this world. And Dr. Berkelaar really does engage the students in care for creation and working with it. And I've talked to a number of his students. In fact, my grandson, I believe, has taken a course with him. And he has worked with the waters of the city of Hamilton and the pollution that has occurred. And I'm looking forward to hearing more about that work, and also, as he puts it, in the framework of a Christian worldview, and specifically the framework of planetary boundaries. So, Dr. Berkelaar, we look forward to your presentation.
All right, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity, for the invitation, and for the opportunity to speak. And I'm going. Well, I'll just dive in then. So, first, a little bit of background about myself, and I think sometimes it's important to sort of share the background in a context. I think like anyone, I think my background has shaped who I am and what my interests are, and I've come to realize that a lot of my background is shaped around engagement with creation care and the physical world. So I grew up on a farm in Nova Scotia, and here is a beautiful aerial shot of the farm that I grew up on. And then went to study. My undergrad was in biology and chemistry. And then I went on to that was in Nova Scotia, the undergraduate, and then graduate studies at the University of Guelph. I studied plant stress physiology, environmental toxicology, a lot right on the border of biology, chemistry, toxicology, how plants interact with their environment and with some of the stresses that they're exposed to. After my PhD, I spent 3 years at ECHO. ECHO is a NGO that their mission is to serve agricultural development workers overseas, and that was a formative time for me. I had grown up on a farm. I had done graduate studies in plant sciences for many years. Tropical agriculture is a different kettle, and I learned an awful lot about challenges of growing crops in the tropics in the 3 years that I was there. Our family moved to Hamilton in 2003. I've been teaching at Redeemer since then, and it's been a really good home for me. So for this talk today, I'm going to sort of break it into 3 parts, I guess. I'm going to talk about the Holocene, the Anthropocene, what some are calling the Great Acceleration, and also this concept resilience, which I mean it's an important concept for people, but I think increasingly for the environment as well. I'm then going to shift and introduce the concept of planetary boundaries. And then talk about some of our work and here in Hamilton and at Redeemer and how it kind of fits within this framework. So the Holocene, I pulled this graph from a paper that we give to students and engage with them. But it's so striking that it seems like, as far as we can tell by looking at historical records, that around 10,000 years ago, climate kind of warmed and then stabilized. And I mean, one of the things that I learned at ECHO, it's somewhat shocking where and how people live. They live in extremely dry places, dry and hot places, dry and cold places, humid places. But they all find a way to extract resources, food from the environment they live in. And that works, I think, as long as climate is at least semi-predictable and reliable. They find strategies to grow food. And I mean, this stable period of sort of climate history coincides with the rise of civilizations all over the world, in Egypt, in the Middle East, in China, in Peru. And I'm so struck, the paper that we take this from, it's not a Christian publication. But they refer to this term as a period of grace. And I just absolutely love that language, that it seems to be a gift that has allowed humans to flourish in what seems to be all corners of the world. And, there's now, I know, a good debate happening within the geologists. Are we entering a new era? Are we entering the Anthropocene, where human activities are a driving force behind global change? And it's up for debate whether we're entering a new era. It's up for debate if we are when it started. Maybe with the Industrial Revolution, maybe with the dawn of the nuclear era. A lot of people sort of point to the 1950s as a time, after World War II, where population began to grow, where affluence started to increase, and a whole lot of curves started to bend upward. And you can look at all kinds of data from all kinds of different places, and see what some call the Great Acceleration. And I've pulled out a few. So, percent of 1970s loss of tropical rainforests. I mean, there's a gradual loss and then it curves upward. Population is increasing and then curves upward. Temperatures curve upwards. The amount of water that we use for agriculture and industry, I don't know when we began measuring this, but curves upward and steeply. Fertilizer consumption, kind of low and then rapidly curves upward. Damming of rivers for irrigation and for hydroelectricity, there's some and then rapidly curves upward. And if I go to the next slide, I mean, there's a lot of curves that you can come up with. And there's some kind of even funny ones. Students and I have kind of fun diving into these. The bottom left here is the number of motor vehicles that have been that are on the road. This one in the middle, I'm hoping you can see my mouse here. The one in the middle is the number of McDonald's restaurants in the planet. On the far right bottom corner, it's the numbers of species that are lost due to loss of habitat mostly. And a whole bunch of graphs near the top here, they have to do with atmospheric gases that are contributing to climate change. So, there's a lot of curves that are trending upward at a rapid pace. And, we're going to talk about planetary boundaries in a bit, but the folks involved in this research says, this simply can't go too long in this trajectory. And we've kind of got to work really hard over the next couple of decades to kind of bend these curves at least flat. And it's my belief that a bunch of them are going to have to trend downward, or else there's going to be consequences that are going to be difficult to recover from. Re- Resilience is, I guess, a concept. To me, it's a rich concept, and I want to see resilient students. I want my own kids to have resilience. It's not always a concept that's easy to define. It's, to me, not the same as health. I want to be healthy, but if I'm healthy and not resilient, that means I can be unhealthy with the smallest nudge, right? If I'm resilient, I get the ideal place, I think, is to have both health and resilience, and that means that, to me, that I'm healthy, which is good, but that there's a certain amount of pushing that I can take and still maintain at least some level of health and not sort of collapse. So a couple of definitions, and the definitions are always nice to read clearly. They clarify things for me. Right? The ability of people or things to feel better quickly after something unpleasant, such as a shock or injury or etc. And this is maybe a broader and a helpful definition when you think of environmental concerns. The ability of a substance, and I would maybe gently say an ecosystem, or maybe the planet as a whole, to return to its original shape after it has been bent, stretched, or pressed. And so, how do we think about ecosystems as resilient? How do we think about our planet as resilient? And, a colleague and I teach a senior seminar class. We work through planetary boundaries and talk about them. And on occasion, I've used sort of these figures, and there's another one on a coming graph as well to help illustrate this. So, one way to kind of imagine how resilience plays a role, and I would say, look, at this hollow is the status of the planet that we've enjoyed for roughly 10,000 years, and sort of the height of the valley, or the walls of the valley that it's in, might represent how resilient the systems are. And so, if there's a disturbance and you kind of shift whatever it is you're measuring out of the place that it resided for a while, if you take that disturbance away, really the only place this planet can go is back where it was. And it might take some time. There might be some damage that's caused in the interim, but the natural resting place is kind of where it was. In a less resilient system, the Earth is still in the Holocene, but there's less resilience. If you disturb something, it might end up at a place where it could tip into a new reality. And when we look at planetary boundaries, I'm going to name a couple. I'll maybe name one right now. If the planet warms a certain amount and then restabilizes, life is still going to exist here, but it's going to be a different planet than it was for 10,000 years. And all kinds of ecosystems, including ones that we depend on for food, like our own agricultural systems, we're going to have to find new ways to live in a new system, and that might be possible. I'm not a pessimistic person. I think we'll figure that out as long as it doesn't shift too quickly. But there's a lot to be said for the systems that we're in now. And there's a lot to be said for trying to, if human activities are responsible for shifting us a little bit away from a certain system, it's entirely possible that our activities can get us back. And the idea of resilience as well, I do remember sort of in some context using the illustration of a Jenga tower. These two towers, and I couldn't find the exact same perspective. They're the same shape, they're the same height. I can kind of imagine, I've told students this before about ecosystems. You can remove a species from an ecosystem and the whole system is pretty much functioning as it was. And you can remove another species and another species and another species, and the system just looks kind of the same that it was. But eventually you remove a species and the whole thing collapses, and you wonder, well, what happened? we've been pressuring this system for a long time, and it remains standing. But then it gets to some point where it just can't take another nick, another nick taken out of it. And so, yeah, I mean, the ecologists remind us how, the more biodiversity you have in any system, the more resilient it is to change and its ability to adapt to the changes that are being pushed on it. All right, so let's shift gears and talk about planetary boundaries. And I'm not sure how familiar this is of a concept for all of you, but it's been a really helpful framework for me in my teaching, and for sort of engaging with students on both global environmental issues, but also the local context of them, because I mean, global problems are solved by a whole pile of local changes, I think, and we work where we are often. So where does the concept come from? There's a research center in Sweden called the Stockholm Resilience Center, and it's an enormous group of interdisciplinary scientists who are publishing an awful lot in this area. And they first published an article in Nature. It's a bit of a very brief summary article. It's a very quick read, where they introduced their concept of planetary boundaries. The same year, they published a fairly in-depth assessment. There's a huge sort of appendix that goes with this that's available as well. And they introduce and dive right into the concept of planetary boundaries. That was 2009 as well. In 2015, they basically did an update, and they basically reviewed the work, and a whole bunch of planetary boundaries kind of stayed the same, but a few they tweaked some of their assessments. All right, so how? What's a good way to explain planetary boundaries? I remember reading the article. There's a lovely TED Talk that goes with the first article as well, and the concept is introduced as, look, there's planetary systems that sort of explain the planet as we know it, that allow human flourishing, that allow life to flourish in all kinds of corners of the earth. And I distinctly remember reading this and thinking, oh my word, how many systems are we talking about? And when they fleshed out the concept, I was shocked to discover that they settled on 9. There's 9, significant planetary systems that do much to explain the beautiful world we have from this angle. And what they've done for each of the systems is they work to, and there's a lot of background research on this, of course. What is the system? How does it work? But then they look for, and they've worked very hard on this, on characterizing 1 or 2 variables for each that can be measured that tell us the status of the system. What is the current state of this system that we want to sort of monitor? And then further, they've said, look, what is the limit or the boundary of this variable that we ought not to cross? And I'm going to I'm not going to introduce all 9 to you, but I'm going to pick a few, and I'll explain why I've chosen the ones that I have to introduce them. So here is this is, I don't know how many of you have seen this figure. It's at least in my circles becoming very, very famous. But they have the 9 systems around the outside. There's a blue circle in the middle, and that represents I can put it up here. The border, and let's just pick climate change. Climate change is in the yellow according to their assessment. If it were, so that's the status of the climate change system or boundary. If their variable was below this blue line, they would say we're in the green zone, and they would have concluded that that is an area of low risk of bad outcomes. If it's above the red, this is a zone of high risk of bad outcomes. And then there's something respectable about this. They said, look, there's a lot of uncertainties here. And so we have a zone in the middle we call it a zone of uncertainty, where we'd rather not be, but we're glad we're not in the red. All right, so I'm going to introduce these this way. So a good news planetary boundary. Maybe I should have done the good news one last, but it's stratospheric ozone depletion. And so I suspect many of you are kind of familiar with the history. There was decades of use of CFCs. In the late 70s, there's a very, very important publication by some chemists that showed that chlorine can, at least in theory, in a lab, destroy ozone. Very, very soon after that, it was shown by NASA that ozone was depleting year over year. That was the 1980s, really. And then by the 90s, there was a very, I would say, rather impressive political response. If you look at the history of that, it's a lot like the climate change response. They picked a past target, they gave themselves a future deadline, and they said, we're going to cut back below that target by that date. So they have set the boundary, right? And these boundaries recognize that there's going to be some change. They said the green line is 5%. That they're saying, we can afford to lose some ozone, but we shouldn't lose more than 5% from pre-industrial levels. And their zone of uncertainty is 5 to 10%. And when they carefully review the data, they say, look, this boundary is only transgressed over Antarctica. It's only transgressed in the spring. And so we can conclude we're in the green zone. And you can just see down here low, there's a bit of a green edge here. And we can celebrate this. We want to keep monitoring ozone levels to be sure, but this is not in crisis. And ozone, I think the latest research I've read on it is that they're becoming convinced that the depletion is as extreme as it's going to get. And that if we wait till 2050, 2070, that the ozone, we expect and hope and pray that the ozone layer is going to begin to recover, because we're simply not producing CFCs very much anymore. All right, what about a really well-known planetary boundary? And there's an awful lot of news and political engagement with climate change. And it's a little bit striking to look at the planetary boundaries model and just see it as one of 9 important slices. But we talk about these gases that trap infrared energy, that cause a warmer Earth and rising seas and melting ice and all that goes with that. So climate change, the boundary that has been set by these folks is 350 parts per million. There's 2 boundaries, actually. For this, they've said, look, there's actually 2 things we want to carefully monitor. So one is just simply atmospheric carbon dioxide, which is, it's one that everyone understands and talks about. So 350 is their border between green and yellow, and 450 is their border between yellow and red. The other thing that they track is energy imbalance. It's basically the difference between energy in and energy out at the Earth's atmosphere. So, they're saying, look, the Earth can warm as long as it doesn't warm too rapidly. And they've set that boundary at 1 watt per meter squared. And again, what that means is that for, on average, every meter squared of the Earth, it gains 1 more watt than it loses. And their zone of uncertainty is 1 to 1.5. So current status is a very different situation from the ozone layer story. We're at 410, and we're increasing by around 2 or 2.5 parts per million per year. The energy imbalance is over 2, although there's quite a large zone of uncertainty around that. And so the conclusion is that we're in the yellow, and we're kind of ticking closer to the red. And there's a lot of the scientists talk a lot. The politicians are starting to settle on, let's try and avoid more than a 1.5 to a 2 degree warming. And that is going to cause a lot of change, but I think the hope is that the change is going to be manageable. Right, next one is an unquantified planetary boundary. And as someone who studied toxicology in an environmental field, this one really interests me. And so they define novel entities as it's a bit of a broad definition. It's mostly chemical pollution, but they refer to genetically modified organisms as well. They also refer to radiation would be included in this, which is energy. It includes chemicals never before seen on this planet, but it also includes things like trace metals that might be buried deep underground, but now they're circulating in the superficial environment and exposed. They are exposing, or living things are exposed to them, like cadmium through water or soil and so on. But it's a long list. There's like 100,000 new chemicals that weren't in existence sort of, maybe the turn of the 1900s. So DDT is a poster child. There's lists of other pesticides. There's all kinds of industrial chemicals, dyes and solvents and pharmaceuticals that are increasingly showing up in water. One of the faster growing sort of atmospheric gases are some of the flame retardants that we're soaking our furniture and curtains with. I'm increasingly reading and disturbed about microplastics showing up in water and in soil and in food and so on. And so, what are these things doing? What are they doing in mixtures? And it might not be mixtures of 2 or 3, but I think, we're all exposed to, a long list of these things, and we're exposed to them over a lifetime. And so, toxicology as a discipline is really, really good at assessing the toxicity of a single thing, or maybe a mixture of 2 or 3. It's not as good at all at assessing the impact of the sum total of these on the planet as a whole. And so it's really interesting to read about planetary boundaries and novel entities. There's general consensus that they're important and that there's a limit that we ought not to cross. There's absolutely no consensus. And it's a real mystery to me, like, what is the single number that you would measure? Some of these things are way more toxic than others. Some of them are toxic to plants and not animals. Some of them vice versa. There's no agreement on how to sort of come up with a single number that might represent the status of the planet with regards to novel entities. And it's even hard to imagine what kind of number we should be striving for, I think. So I know this is faint here, but it just simply says no global quantification. All right, what about a planetary boundary in crisis? And one of the planetary boundaries is called biosphere integrity, which talks about biodiversity loss. And this is not news to us, I think, that there's a global biodiversity crisis that seems to be beginning. There are 2 ways that they are working to assess this. The easier one, and it's not that easy because we're not even sure how many species exist, is simply loss of genetic diversity, which is easily characterized by the extinction rate. And the units that they use are extinctions per million species years. Possibly more important is the loss of functional diversity, and that's a whole lot harder to characterize. So there is something called the Biodiversity Intactness Index, and there's a lot of work done in Southern Africa where they're trying to carefully characterize, what is the level of functional biodiversity here, or functional diversity, how much has been lost, and how much can we afford to lose before the systems are at risk of collapse. So if you look over at the figure here, and I'll just go to the boundary. Genetic diversity, right? They're saying the boundary is an extinction rate 10 times above the background extinction rate. And we are at, somewhere between 100 and 1,000 times above the background rate. So we're not even close. to the green zone. We're far, far into the red. Functional diversity on a planetary basis not yet characterized. Yeah, we're in the red zone, at least on the one we can measure. All right, and my favorite planetary boundary, I don't know if this is even fair. It's just the one that intrigues me the most. It's the one that I'm working on now, I suppose, and it's the one that I spend a lot of time sort of thinking about and trying to understand some key things here. And it's biogeochemical flows. So biogeochemical, it's the movement of elements through living things, through soil and through the air and through water. There's a continual flow of elements around this planet, and we're heavily modifying these systems. We've modified the carbon cycle. We have ridiculously modified the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles. So really, really briefly, our modification since about 1909, we discovered a way to extract nitrogen from the air. And we call this the Haber-Bosch process. It's the conversion of atmospheric nitrogen into bioavailable fertilizers. There's a beautiful book that summarizes the discovery of this process, and they describe, the early scientists were over the moon excited, describing, you found a way to turn air into bread. But we manufacture fertilizers, we apply fertilizers to land. A relatively small percentage of that ends up in our crops. Most of it soaks into the ground and contaminates groundwater or runs off and into our surface waters, where it causes eutrophication, excessive algal growth, decay of algae, a loss of oxygen, and eventually, systems that can't support fish life very well. Very, very similar story for phosphorus, except we're not fixing it, we're just mining it. We're mining it, making it really bioavailable, we're applying it to land, and it's a pretty similar story after that. All right, so both of these are in the red. What is the proposed boundaries for phosphorus? And these numbers are a bit astoundingly huge. They've kind of set it at how many billion tons of phosphorus per year are flowing into our oceans. And they said, look, we should not exceed 11 billion tons per year. For nitrogen, they've kind of gone at it more from the amount pulled out of the atmosphere. They say we shouldn't be pulling out more than 62 billion tons per year of nitrogen and applying it to land. And it's really interesting. This is chemical fertilizer use, but this is also what I've thought of as a pretty green way of doing it with legumes. But even if you intensively farm with legumes, you are ending up with a lot of nitrogen being pulled out of the air, and a lot of it ends up in water then. So what is the current status for phosphorus? We're losing, it's hard to assess this exactly, but around 22 billion tons per year. For nitrogen, over 150 billion tons per year. And so you can see that. And this is the one that kind of makes me nervous. I mean, we've got 8 billion people. We're going to add a couple billion more by the middle of the century. This is, I try and get the students to see, this is the rock and a hard place kind of place to be. I mean, we environmentally, we want to see, less fertilizer being used for the sake of the environment. But my goodness, we can't destabilize food production while we do that. So we are in the red zone here, and I would maybe add here, there's a lot of regional problems that exist, but the global problem is that if we add too much fertilizer to the oceans, the concern is that, it'll take some time, you give it a couple centuries, and the whole oceans turn anoxic. And it's impossible to imagine that scenario. All right, really quickly, the ones that I never talked about, aerosol loading. That's basically particles in the air, whether it's solid or liquid. They do impact climate in confusing ways. You fill the air full of dust that might dim the sun and slow down climate change, but some of them have been shown to actually enhance it because of the way they bend light and interact with radiation. This one is also globally unquantified. In the subcontinent of India, a lot of work is being done on how aerosols seem to be changing monsoon patterns. And so they are showing regional impacts on weather and therefore agriculture. And so they measure optical density and set some limit. They're trying to set some limits with that. Ocean acidification, so that's carbon dioxide dissolving in the oceans, causing pH changes. We're in the green zone, but right next to yellow for that one. Fresh water use. It's the amount of fresh water that we're using, that we're withdrawing from watersheds, mostly for agricultural reasons. Globally, we're in the green, but that kind of masks really important regional impacts. And then the other one that I did not mention is land system change, and the variable that they have settled on is the percentage forest cover compared to what existed prior to the Industrial Revolution. And so they've set percentages for temperate, percentages for tropical areas, and said we really ought to leave this much forest cover for all kinds of reasons. All right, so a couple comments on pros and cons of the planetary boundaries model. So number one, I do think, and I'm hopeful about this, that this is environmental issues can feel overwhelming, but to see them presented this way with there's an awful lot of data underlying this model and the thresholds that are being presented, but there's not a lot of numbers to swallow in terms of how do we understand where things are and where maybe we think they should be. So, scientists do the work, but there needs to be really clear communication to politicians, to policymakers, to the public. And I hope and pray that this might be a model that maybe clears things up. Also does a pretty decent job prioritizing things. I'm glad we're talking a lot about climate change, but it's not the only issue that needs to be looked at. There are climate change solutions that might be catastrophic for biodiversity concerns, for fertilizer use concerns. And I'm thinking now, for example, of trying to grow biofuels to replace fossil fuels. What's really nice about the planetary boundary model is it reminds us all that these things are all connected. The different planetary systems, they are not standalone, and they're not all kind of equal. The climate change one is key. The biodiversity one is key. They're all key, but it's really interesting. There's two different boundaries. One is climate change and one is ocean acidifications. But in all honesty, they're going to be addressed with the same solutions. And that's good to know too, I think. And I have really appreciated, and I think the students have too, you'd have to ask them. It's really, really nice to realize that pretty much everything that I talk about in my 100 and 200 level environmental science courses that kind of introduce students to the major as a whole, I can remind them, okay, we're talking about this planetary boundary with this unit. We're talking about that planetary boundary with this unit. And it's helpful for me and for them to see, okay, yes, we're talking about this, and this is where it fits into sort of global and local sort of concerns. What about some cons? It's important to talk about a global framework. I think in a globalized world and how interconnected our economies are and how certain problems are simply just not local. Climate change is not a local problem. Ozone loss is not a local problem. And what I mean by that, doesn't matter where the CFCs or where the carbon comes from, it's gonna impact climate, all over. But when you read that water use as a global issue is in the green, and then you read that 25% of all rivers run dry for parts of the year because we're basically extracting every drop of water from them during the dry season, then you realize it's maybe not healthy to just look at that and check the box and say there's no fresh water concerns. We can move on and focus on other things. And even the second version of their publication said we need to work more on, yes, let's talk about the planetary issue, but let's also get to regional concerns and maybe break this down on a bit of a regional basis. Water use can be in the red in the Middle East and in the green in Canada, and maybe that's important to know too. Time frames are not so clear. There's way too much nitrogen and phosphorus flowing into the oceans right now and causing kind of coastal eutrophication events and so on. But the global concern is like a large scale, like ocean-wide anoxic event where the whole ocean becomes anoxic and just simply can't support life that requires oxygen. But when you read the small print, they're like, yeah, that would take like 800 years. And so that's not to say we dismiss it, but it's also important to say, well, there's some other problems here that are more urgent in terms of a time frame as well. And I guess the last sort of con that I would like to highlight is that if you focus only on planetary boundaries, what you might conclude is that the goal here is to get into the green and get as far into the green as possible, and that will be the most resilient system that we have. The counter to that is we have real social problems as well. I mean, we need to find a way to reduce hunger and malnutrition. We need to find a way to provide, healthy potable water to parts of the world where there might be hundreds of millions of people where this is not easily available to them. And so how do you mesh sort of this very helpful framework which addresses appropriately environmental concerns with also sort of the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the need to meet people's needs? And there have been some responses to this, which I would like to read more about. I've read some of the papers that have popped up recently, but if you remember the planetary boundaries, they labeled it a safe place for humanity or a safe space for humanity. Here's a bit of a copy and an addition. What about a safe and just space for humanity? And some of these folks who are economists, and they're referring to this as sort of donut economics, they're kind of saying, look, the goal should not be to grow the economies indefinitely. But what we want to do is equitably share resources that, yes, there's a ceiling to these things. There's only so much of certain resources we should use, but there's also sort of a social floor. There's a minimum that we should be using as well. And so I just kind of stuck here the plant, the fertilizer, the biogeochemical flows, right, is red, it's bad, it's yellow, it's better and better. But they're saying, look, you take your nitrogen and phosphorus, and we need to use enough to have a secure food system. So we're going to have to balance, the short and medium term needs of finding food with longer term impacts these are tough calls. These are tough calls to make, I think. And I mean, Scripture has a lot to say about the environment, and I reached out to a friend who used to be a chaplain here at Redeemer years ago and said, "Help me, remember, what does Scripture say about limits, environmental limits specifically?" And I mean, some of these passages I was aware of, but they were good to be reminded of as well. There's some real quirky things in Deuteronomy which very directly get to our interaction with the environment, and resources that we might want. If you come across a bird's nest beside the road, either in a tree or on the ground, and the mother is sitting on the young or on the eggs, do not take the mother with the young. Right? Take some, but not everything. When you enter the land I'm going to give you, the land itself must observe a Sabbath to the Lord. There's a lot written about this in Leviticus. Don't harvest your grapes, don't harvest this. Use the land, but not excessively or incessantly, right? Give it rest. And there are some really striking passages that suggest that. I think there's a passage that refers to the 70 years of exile that the Israelites were into. That said, look, if you look at the math, those are the years of Sabbath they were supposed to be giving the land the whole time we're there, and that they weren't doing that. And so part of what the Lord's punishment was that the land was going to get its rest all at once for 70 years straight. Is it not enough for you to drink clear water? So use resources, but don't be wasteful, and don't make it so that others can't have access to the resources too. And this is one of my favorite paintings. I am so struck by this painting. It's a painting by Rembrandt titled "The Risen Christ Appearing to Mary." Why are you crying? Who is it you are looking for? Thinking he was the gardener. And the artist here, and I've heard another speaker go down this track as well. I mean, she might have thought he was the gardener because she was stricken by grief and couldn't see straight. But she might have thought he was the gardener because he looked like the gardener. And there's something about this painting that always sends a chill down my spine. It's kind of like, Jesus rose from the dead. We're now living between his first resurrection and his coming back. And he's kind of almost showing us, okay, there's work to be done. I've got my shovel. I've got my pruning knife. And come work with me to restore what needs to be restored. All right, so I will wrap up with a look at some of the work that we've been doing here, and it's been a delightful occurrence for me. So I can go through these slides a little bit quickly, I think. I am struck, by the way, and I'll throw all of these up. My master's was on the effect of ultraviolet radiation on plants. So there's the ozone depletion planetary boundary. I never knew anything about planetary boundary. They hadn't been discussed yet, but I was working on one. My PhD was on uptake of trace elements by plants, trace elements that get into agricultural systems because they contaminate fertilizers or sewage sludge. So there's your novel entities, planetary boundaries. Currently, Dr. Darren Brower and I have been looking an awful lot at nitrogen and phosphorus contamination in urban watersheds, and that's absolutely biogeochemical flows. And, growing up on a farm and working at ECHO, if you start talking about agriculture and food systems and planetary boundaries, you realize that you hit every single one of them. And I mean, there's, if you think about what we're going to, design of cities, how we're going to transport ourselves, it's how we grow our food that's going to need to address some of these environmental concerns all over. So this is a picture of Cootes Paradise, and I'm not sure how many of you are local or less local, but this is a beautiful marsh, wetland, like honestly right in the heart of Hamilton. It's an absolute gem. If you look at, this is a picture from Google Maps, it's green. There's too much nutrients being added to it, and you can see also this is Grindstone Creek. So the creeks dump their water in, and in some cases there's too much nitrogen, too much phosphorus, resulting in too much algal growth, and it is absolutely impacting the quality of this marsh. So what about watersheds then? If you again look at Google Maps, kind of hone in this region, and Redeemer is right to the bottom left edge of that circle. Look at the map on the left. The green is the escarpment, and this is the Chedoke watershed. I've come to love this watershed. There's almost no water that sees the sky. I'm going to quickly tell you the history of this watershed and show you some pictures. But there's a whole bunch of buried creeks, underground creeks that drain into the eastern edge of Cootes Paradise. And this watershed is not in good shape. Here's an old map. I love maps. I love old maps. This is the escarpment right along here, and I think I've highlighted it here. I zoomed it up and highlighted. This is the Chedoke Creek, right? This was all farmland. Here's the city downtown starting to expand, but this is all farmland, and there was a creek that was open to the sky, and it just sort of ran into a wetland on the edge of the city and into this beautiful marsh. And the underlying map is a map that some folks at the city of Hamilton gave me. And I know it's too faint to see, but there's many, many, many purple arrows in this map, and they represent all of the buried stormwater pipes on Hamilton Mountain. And the arrows show which way they flow. And there's a huge pipe that starts, well, it's right on the edge of the watershed, but there's a buried spring somewhere that's recorded in the history books that there's a farm put there because there used to be a spring of beautiful fresh water. And they basically buried this creek in an enormous, like 2-meter pipe. And it now just sort of follows the road, but follows the rough contours that it once did. And it's dumped over the escarpment, and then it's buried again. It runs over the Chedoke Golf Course, and it runs along the 403 to Coots Paradise. Here's that 2-meter buried pipe. It's not really a pipe; it's like a cement brick structure. You can kind of see it in this picture on the top right. You can kind of see the entrance there, and there's a. I would never do it. I'd be terrified to be in there. If I was ever caught in a rain, you'd be in big trouble. But there's a guy that walks in these things and takes beautiful pictures and posts them on the web. It's not legal or recommended, but they are beautiful pictures. There's a whole network of underground pipes that keeps our city from flooding. And our sample sites, again, on the left, you can see this is a scenic drive from below. There's a cement retaining wall with a road behind it. And here's quite a large pipe buried under the road that captures another tributary of the creek. And if you go to parks, you find here's a little creek and it just disappears into a big cement structure underground. All right, so project history, and I want to honor your time and wrap up pretty soon. I'm afraid I've gone a little longer than I was asked to, and I apologize. Darren Brower started this project in an analytical chemistry class in 2012. And after a couple rounds, we did some reorganizing of curriculum here, and it shifted to a class that I teach. Since 2015, we've found funding to hire summer research students, and we've gone at this regularly for getting close to 10 years now. What's really interesting is we've been faithfully sampling and measuring water quality in the summer and in the fall. The city of Hamilton at this time has invested in trying to repair degraded infrastructure. There was a long 4-year combined sewage leak that occurred. And in 2018, the city started adding phosphorus to drinking water to combat lead that's leaching out of the pipes. They call it a corrosion control program. So there's been a lot of changes in the watershed during which the time that we've been measuring. So this part of the watershed has mostly separate sewage systems. So there's actually 2 buried pipes. Sewage goes to the sewage treatment plant. Stormwater just gets dumped in the creeks. But there's cross connections. It's an appalling error from the 1970s where hundreds of houses were literally cross connected. So the house was built, sewage went to the creeks, and stormwater went to the sewage treatment plant, and then you have a watershed that regularly gets sewage releases. 2018, the city began adding phosphorus to drinking water, and Hamilton has the distinction of having an incredible loss of drinking water through cracks in our pipes. And so we have, the city estimates that they lose like 28% of all of the drinking water they produce. And so the question that I have is you're taking drinking water, you're adding phosphorus to it to protect from corrosion, but then it's leaking. And so where does the water go, and where does the phosphorus that's in it go if it leaks out of these pipes? So here are our sample sites, and this is a delight of Hamilton that normally these pipes are buried from beginning to end, but we've got an escarpment. And so our sample sites are all waterfalls, and we can hike along a trail and sometimes jump some fences and gather water samples. And we do some measurements in the field, and the rest we bring to the lab. And we analyze for bacterial contamination. We analyze for chemical contamination, phosphorus, total phosphorus, nitrate, chloride. We analyze for BOD, which is biological oxygen demand. It's a pretty common assessment of sewage contaminated water. And over the last couple of years, we've gotten into microbial source tracking. And I won't say too much about this except for the science part of me. It's really, really cool. We gather fairly large samples of water. We filter them to extract bacteria. We extract DNA from those bacteria, and we specifically target a species called Bacteroidetes. And it turns out their genetic sequence is ever so slightly different based on what host they came from. So we can like E. coli just tells you there's feces in the water, but with this assessment, we can say, well, there's feces and it came from a dog, or there's feces and it comes from human sewage. And probably next summer we might try and pull out a couple of other animals as well and see if we can identify what else is there. So here are the microbial source tracking results. There's at certain times and weather patterns, like we find that like close to half or a quarter of the feces, the fecal contamination that we find comes from human sources. And Scenic Falls, this is our control in some ways. It's way off to the west in a conservation area, and I mean it's fairly clean water, and there's rarely evidence of human fecal contamination. But the other ones, it's just pretty widespread. The numbers, by the way, reflect the dog. Dog is widespread too, but the numbers are really, really small. All right, and here are trends, and I'm not going to spend tons of time in this graph, but I'll highlight a couple things. So take a look at Mount View Falls, which is kind of in the middle here. From 2012 to 2016, the city identified cross connections, right? These houses that had their sewage pipes misconnected. And they were digging up people's lawns and fixing them. And it's so delightful for me to see, well, look what happened to the water quality. It radically improved. There was like a third as much phosphorus. Nitrate went down. BOD went down. This is a log scale, but E. coli fell by orders of magnitude. All good news. And then in 2018, they started adding phosphorus to drinking water, and we see phosphorus creep way back up in Cliffview Falls, in Chedoke Creek, in Mount View Falls. And then in 2020, they announced, we found a huge water leak on this address. And I looked it up, and sure enough, it was water that was leaking into Mount View Falls. So if they start finding water leaks and patching them up, then there will not be phosphorus getting into this watershed and contributing to downstream problems in Coots Paradise. Yeah, hundreds of cross-connection repairs in this watershed. So I'm really, really grateful that the city has invested in this. It's not cheap, and it's very time-consuming. And now more news coming about leaks. And I was talking to somebody in the city. They were talking about a leak, and he just groaned and said it was a biggie. Like, these aren't like pinhole leaks in pipes. They're like gushers. Their water is flowing underground and finding its way into the creeks, I think, and working its. I mean, water finds its watershed. So if you have a leak, the water's got to go somewhere. Last comment I'll make is that we have really come to know a lot of really cool partners. We've partnered with folks at the City of Hamilton. We've been invited to meetings with city councilors. We were invited to present to the Public Works Committee and talk about infrastructure issues. We've been funded by Redeemer's Center for Christian Scholarship and by research funds here, but also by Environment Canada through Great Lakes Sustainability funds. And we've just worked with folks from the Hamilton Conservation Authority and the people that are restoring Hamilton Harbor. And it's been been good and enjoyable and educational for me. And I suspect and hope that it sort of enhanced my teaching to have these connections and talk about, eutrophication in a context that matters. All right, so to summarize, and I can do this quick and then happily answer any questions you might have. We do have this calling to care for creation. I think we can learn about God from Scripture and what He wants us to do. But I think, science for me is also a way to know about God and to learn about His world and what needs to happen. And project-based learning, meaningful project-based learning, it can be a lot of work at times, but it can be really, really rewarding. My wife can attest, there's been days that I've gone out at 6 a.m. to gather water samples, so I have them ready for a lab in the afternoon. But for the students to know that they're real water samples, and for me to tease them and look them in the eye and say, you can't just do this test, you have to do it right because we need the numbers. They step up their game, and that's good. And students have stepped up and been involved in presentations, and I hope and pray had a good experience from that. And that is the end of my presentation. So thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer. Thank you for your hands. I'm happy to answer questions that anyone might have if you have any.
Edward, it's Peter Schultens.
Yes.
I'm just wondering, like we live in this neighborhood, the Chedoke watershed, and when we're out walking, we can, especially this time of year, smell what smells like sewage coming up out of the storm drains.
Yeah.
So does that mean that there's likely a cross connection there, or does just the regular stormwater smell that way too?
No, I mean, if you're smelling sewage, and I've smelled it as well, I think it's likely sewage. And if you look at maps, and you're right, you're in an area where it is cross connected, but if you start walking in neighborhoods a little bit farther east, there the sewage system, the infrastructure is a combined system. So the grates in the street, they're flowing with both, stormwater and sewage. And there you can really smell, sewage venting out of the streets.
Right. But that's going to the treatment center, right? It's not going.
That's going to the sewage treatment plant. You're absolutely right. So you should smell it there. But we've smelled it, and we smell it right coming off the waterfalls at times.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
So I'm wondering if you've looked at the groundwater flow paths related to the water leaks or inflows into these buried creek channels and things like that.
Yeah, I have not. I guess when I started looking at this, the groundwater flow seemed really simple to me. It was all through pipes. But if you've got a pipe that's leaking, then at least it starts not in a pipe. But I think we're finding evidence that it's finding its way into these buried creeks because of the increase in phosphorus. But now you're getting into like hydrogeology, and that's not my discipline. And I mean, we're right on the escarpment though. And even if you hike there, you often see water kind of bubbling out of the ground where water is sort of flowing its way downhill through fissures in the rock and stuff. So, I mean, where those sites are, they're not far from Cootes Paradise as far as the crow flies. And I suspect they're just going to work their way kind of north and make their way, that way. But that's not my expertise. And no, I don't know, the direction of flow. Yes. Willard.
Why is phosphorus added to the water?
Yeah, that's a great question. So our water around here is hard. And so that means it has a certain amount of calcium and magnesium naturally in it. And phosphorus will react with those and precipitate, and it'll coat the inside of the pipes with a film that keeps the water out of contact with the lead if the pipes are lead. There's a whole bunch of places in the older parts of the city where there's a whole bunch of lead pipes connected from the water mains to people's houses. And at least in the short term, the solution to that is to add phosphorus to the water in the hopes that it reduces lead exposure. But the long-term solution is to dig those up, I know that even recently I got an email, a letter from the city saying, go to this part of your basement. Your house is old. Confirm that your pipe is not lead. If it's lead, let us know. And you have to pay something, but they're gonna help homeowners replace the old lead pipes. But that's what they're trying to do, is to reduce lead exposure by coating the inside of the pipes.
Thank you.
When I'm talking, I don't monitor chats, but I do see there's some chat comments now.
So Edward, while Andrew is typing in the chat his question, I have a quick question. The presentation on the climate change was quite interesting. Is there efforts locally to educate the general population on climate change, and how is that going? What has worked?
Oh boy.
No, loaded question, right?
It is a loaded question. So, educate the general public. It's certainly part of the curriculum here at Redeemer that students that, and it's interesting. I teach a couple of environmental courses, but I also teach a course. It's the course that I just walked out of before settling here. It's a science course for non-science majors, and it's like, how do you? It's great that you want to study disciplines other than science, but in this day and age, you have to know some of the major issues. And so, there is an attempt here at Redeemer to make non-science students at least aware of climate change and some of the strategies that could be addressed. It's part of the environmental science program. But, more broadly, I keep hearing, some of my contacts at the city of Hamilton saying, the modeling, and back to the water, the modeling that is being done for climate change in Southern Ontario talks a lot about extra water, like intense summer rainfalls and so on. And so certainly the city is looking at this aging, crumbling infrastructure and saying, how in the world do we prepare for climate change, where there's going to be even more water flowing through these pipes. But to be blunt, are people tired about climate change? It's in the news so much, and it's often presented as a catastrophe that people kind of give up thinking about, I think, in terms of, it's such a big thing. I don't know what I could ever possibly do. So I don't really have a sense about how well we're doing as a society, sort of, educating people about climate change, and I don't know, convincing people that, yes, we're going to need some big policy changes and new transportation infrastructure, but there's a lot of things that individual people can and should be doing as well. Willard?
Are you hearing that the city of Hamilton is planning to make it obligatory to have all rainwater redirected to land rather than sewers?
I have not heard that they're making it obligatory. I know that they're encouraging it, like they're trying to ask people to do it. To be frank, there's people in the intense, like in the really dense downtown, there's people that don't have land to put the water on. Mississauga has changed their tax structure to somewhat link municipal taxes to how much water gets shed off your property. And that's really intrigues me. If you are a homeowner and you were looking at, and they do it by some score. They assess your house the same way they might do an energy audit and say, look, if you do this, this, and this, then your tax goes down by this. And it's very much linked to the fact that if you flood the stormwater infrastructure with water, there's a cost the city has to bear. And so if you shed that water onto your land, you are protecting the watersheds, and maybe you should financially be rewarded for that. And if you do that carefully and right, you start to encourage businesses to put like permeable paving in, and to collect water from the rainfall from the roof to flush their toilets. And you are starting to hear about office buildings that are doing this, and I don't have an issue with that. it can be designed in a way that's not a tax grab. You shift the tax, right? You raise the tax here and you lower it somewhere else to encourage a change in behavior. And personally, I don't have an issue with that. Some people do, but I saw a chat go by about Waterloo. I've read that Waterloo also is Hamilton is not aggressive on this. Mississauga way ahead of us. Waterloo way ahead of us. We'll come around.
Edward, can you hear me now?
I can.
Oh, good. Okay. I think I fixed my problem. I put something into the chat with respect to the Hamilton Harbor RAP and the stewardship program that the RAP is working on now with farmers in the rural watershed, and wondered if you had any knowledge on any reduction in the phosphorus loading from that source.
Yes, that's a lovely question. So the Chedoke watershed is entirely 100% urban. Like there's no farms.
Okay.
In this watershed, but you go to the other side of Coots Paradise and Spencer Creek and Grindstone Creek, which doesn't come into Coots Paradise but goes into Hamilton Harbor, absolutely go through agricultural lands. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of the conservation authorities are working with farmers to talk about buffer strips and fertilizer use along creek edges and stuff to work on this. Mm-hmm. To me, I mean, I grew up on a farm, bit of a tough, a lot of farmers a little bit on the edge. Like if you're going to go to farmers and say, don't use this land, I honestly think you better be ready to compensate them with a bit of a tax break or something else to make it worth their while if you're going to do that. Yeah,
it's a volunteer program that they're doing right now, and it's just having a bit of a buffer if there's any kind of creek running through your farmland, so that you don't have direct runoff from any of the fertilizer you put on the farms. So it requires still a lot of work, but it's the way that they're trying to approach it now.
Yeah. We're getting to the point with watersheds that we're starting to look at what they call source protection, which is to say, look, you can't just look at the water. You got to look at where these watersheds start and the practices that result in phosphorus additions to water and make those changes.
Yeah. I'm just a recently retired environmental manager at Stelco, and we've done. I was on the board of directors for the Bay Area Restoration Council and working with the RAP for quite a while. From an industry standpoint, we did a lot many years ago in reducing our contaminant loading into the harbor, and it's really come down now to the urban and rural in the community itself and trying to manage that. From the point of view of a combined sewer system, I like that idea. It's a great idea because you're treating not only the sewage but also the runoff. But there are still lots of sewage overflows, and there's still lots being ending up going into the harbor directly as well. So more improvement needs to be done. You're right, and all those cross ties.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of cross connections that have not been identified.
Yeah. There was one other thing that came up is there was a research study that was being done by the University of Toronto on phosphorus being released from the sediment that's in the bottom of the harbor, and it seems to go into a cycle. So we could do a lot to try to reduce the flow of phosphorus, the new phosphorus that comes into the harbor, but there's still that stored phosphorus that's in the sediment, and it seems to kind of cycle back through, and that might be something hard to control.
Yeah, and I mean, for the Chedoke Creek, then, I mean, this is the argument for dredging it next summer, which they're going to do because of this big sewage and all the phosphorus that's sitting on the bottom. But
right,
there's regular overflows there. So part of me is like, well, go ahead and dredge it, but there's still gonna be regular overflows. Part of me is a little cynical that I'm glad they're going to dredge it, but it doesn't really treat the problem. I mean, it treats the sewage spill problem, but it doesn't treat the ongoing releases that are coming.
Yeah, I agree. Well, thank you. Good talk.
Thank you.
Well, Edward, I know Ed personally, and he prefers that I call him Edward rather than Dr. Berkelaar. And you've seen that he has a very welcoming kind of presence. Edward, I thank you very much on behalf of all of us for this presentation. I really am happy to have learned about this whole concept of planetary boundaries. And some of your students have told me that it comes up in every course you teach, and I can see why. And I'm happy for the work that you're doing in Hamilton here, and we wish you God's blessings on that work. And I thank all of you who joined us, and hope that you will be well, and that you will continue your faithful walk as Christians and scientists both. Thank you all.